I have a list of part numbers here and I need to know which category they belong to. Over here I've got some master data and I have all the part numbers and corresponding categories and also the part descriptions here. So what I need to do is look up this value here, or all of these values, find them in here and pull in the corresponding category. If you just had a couple, you could just copy and paste this, find all, and it will highlight where it is, and you could then just copy and paste this. Probably more useful on one of these ones further down. Control C, find all, and there it is. So I could have just copied and pasted that. However, in real life, you're probably going to have a long list, either like this or maybe even hundreds, so that would be too time consuming, and copy and paste is prone to error. The other benefit of using a formula is that it's dynamic. When you're copying and pasting, they're static values. So for example, if I were just to copy and paste this over, Control C, then over here Control V, it's electronic components, and that's fine, that's what I wanted. However, if further down the line this changes and we decide to call these electronic assemblies, so I'm just going to change that here in my master data. This changes here, but this doesn't update. This is a static value. It's not linked to this cell here, whereas a formula is. So I'm not going to do the Xlookup. I'm just going to do a basic equals this cell here. So with a formula, if this changes, this now updates. So that is the benefit of a formula. If you know you're going to need this again, or you need to refresh your data, you need to use a formula. Saying that, sometimes I don't like having the formula. So once I've got all my results here, let's just do this one as well while we're here, but it has to be a different formula. In real life, you wouldn't use this, but let's just do that as well here. I might not want to keep the formula. If I double click here, to change the text, I can't. I've just got this formula. It's just bringing me back to this cell here. I can't really do anything with it. It can get a bit confusing. You can start clicking on cells and it just ruins the whole thing. So sometimes what I do, if I know I'm never going to need this data again, or I'm not sending it to anyone, it's just for me here, what I might do is copy and paste the results as values. So let's just escape from here. So rather than having that formula up here, and again, say I can't really do much with it, I can just highlight these, Control C to copy, and on my paste options up here, there's this one here which is values, paste as values. So I just click this, and now when I look up there, you can see they're just static values. So if I did want to change this, I can. I'm just going to press Control Z to undo, and undo again because I want to bring back the formulas. Another way, and I use this quite a lot, especially if I've got a whole range. Let's just say I had values in all of these and I wanted to copy and paste them as values rather than having the formula. See, when I highlight it, it's this green box. When I hover over the edge, my cursor changes to double arrows. So if I just right click, drag away, drag back on top of itself, release my mouse, I then get these options, and here is copy as values only. So at the moment I've got the formula, copy here as values only. They're now static values. It's quite a useful shortcut. I use it quite a lot. I did it quite slowly before, but you can do it quite quickly. I've got a whole range here, hover over, back on top of itself, release, copy here as values only. So there are two different options. You've got the formula which updates and it refreshes, so it's dynamic, or you have your static values. So let's go back to Xlookup. I need to look up these part numbers, find them in this part number list here, and then return the corresponding category. To make it easier, I've named the part numbers using the initials of the category, just so we can see that they're correct. But I would always, when I'm setting up a formula, especially if it's one I'm going to use over and over again, do spot checks and make sure it is definitely pulling in the right result. Because the formula can be correct, but if you haven't done your cell referencing, it might be pulling in the wrong results, and it's not always obvious. Sometimes it's obvious because it will just come back with an error. Therefore, you are going to then double check, but sometimes it might actually just pull in the wrong result and you might not notice if it pulled in some kind of category, might not necessarily be the correct one. Let's just go ahead with the formula, and I'll explain as I go, then I'll go back over it once I've written it. So to start a formula, equals Xlookup. So just start writing the name of the formula. You can either carry on writing manually and open the bracket to start the formula, or you can double click here. There's only one option that starts with Excel here, so here we go, double click, and then you've got the whole name and the open bracket, and then it brings up the syntax. So this is your guide as to what Excel needs to do this formula for you. So it wants a lookup value, lookup array, return array. Array is like a range, and then over here, normally towards the end with these, you get options in square brackets. They're not mandatory, don't need them, but you can use them if you need to. For this one, I always use the match mode because I always want an exact match. There are options where if it can't find this part number, it can just return the nearest thing. So if EC001 wasn't in this list, it might perhaps just return whatever the result is for EC002. In this example, it would actually bring you back the correct answer, but in most instances, you always want an exact match. I want it to pull in the result for EC001. If EC001 isn't in this list, don't return anything. It will return an error. I don't want just the nearest thing. Let's just start with the lookup value. My lookup value is this one part number here. I do want to look all of these up, but at the moment, I'm just concentrating in this cell here. So my lookup value is this part number here. And then I need a comma to move on to the next part of my formula. So I need a comma, and you can see now in bold, it's asking for my lookup array. Array is the range. Where am I looking up this part number, this lookup value? It's going to be this list of part numbers here. So if I click in this first cell, Control Shift arrow down, that's my lookup array, my range, my list of part numbers. I could have just clicked the whole column and it will just have E to E and it will look up that whole column, but I tend to use this way of doing it. Just in case further down the line, if I'm doing some other calculations and I've got some other text over here, that might then become part of my lookup array, which obviously might come up with errors. So I just choose a specific range. That range is never moving. All of those part numbers are in cells E4 to E1389. So I need to lock those cells. If you look at my video on cell referencing, there's more information here, but I will go through it a bit more in this video, just so you can properly get your head around it. Usually when you have an array or a range, you want that absolute reference. So I want $signs in front of the column and in front of the row. And my shortcut for that is F4. So you can see at the moment there's no $signs. When I press the F4 key on my keyboard, if you're using a laptop, you might need to press the function key and F4 at the same time. And now there are my $signs. So that range is locked. I'll explain a bit more once I finish the formula. I'm just in the middle of it here, so I can't get out of it at the moment. So my lookup array is done. So I can press a comma to move on to the next one. And now my return array. The return array is the answer. So the answer is the category. What am I pulling into this blank cell here? That's the category. So I need these cells here. This is my return array. My return array needs to be the same size as my lookup array. And when I say size, I mean if I click here, Control Shift arrow down, you can see that it's the same size. 4 to 1389, 4 to 1389. Even if I knew my answers were in the top 100 rows, I wouldn't have my lookup array going all the way to 1389 and then here just going up to 100. I need them to be the same size. So again, I just need to press the F4 key because these answers aren't moving anywhere. The answers are always in rows 4 to 1389. So I could end my formula there, and actually in this instance it will work because I know these values are unique and they are all listed here. So for this instance I could finish my formula there and just close the bracket. If I wasn't sure, I just want to confirm that it has to be an exact match. Don't just put in the nearest thing. So comma, I don't need this if not found, comma, here's my match mode, exact match. And you've got the other options here. I'll go into that in other videos. I don't want to confuse you too much. This is just going to be a basic Xlookup. 0 for an exact match. Close bracket, enter. So I know for this one that's correct because I can see it right here. If I click in my formula, it's showing you what it's doing. It's looking up this blue cell here, A4, in the red, this part number column, and returning the purple, the category. So that's my formula. I'm going to pull this formula down and we'll see if it returns the correct results. So here is where I'd probably do a few spot checks. So I might look up this part number here, find it here, and look at what category it is. The way I set it up, HW is hardware, ES is electrical supplies, CE consumer electronics, IT. So I know that I'm correct. And I'm fairly confident my formula is correct. The reason why you might not get the correct results would be the cell referencing. Now I'm just going to go through that cell referencing now. So here, you can see for this cell here, it's looking up this value here, and that's the range. I can see that's the correct range. If I go down here, that's correct. It's looking up this. So every time I drag the formula down, if we just quickly look up here, and each time I move down a cell, that row number is moving down with it. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That is correct, because I don't want to always be looking up this cell here. If I'm down here, I want to be looking at this cell here. I don't want to be referencing that cell. So for this example, we don't need to use the dollar signs at all. This is correct. I want it to move down a row each time. But with the ranges, every time I move down a row here, I don't want this to keep moving down a row each time. As you can see, you're then missing out some of those part numbers, and then at the bottom you're just looking up blank cells. So that's why I've absolutely referenced these ranges here. We don't want these always moving down. It's only the lookup value that needs to move. So if we didn't lock these cells, if I just come over here and if I toggle through my F4 key, it will remove some of these dollar signs. So it's remove all of them like that. There we go. So I haven't locked anything. And then if I drag that formula down, it kind of depends on the setup. Because these are quite far down my list, it didn't really matter so much that this has moved down because my hardware is quite far down the list, so it will still find it. If I happen to have this one here, I'm going to get an error because that's no longer in my lookup range. So this is where you have to be careful, because my formula is technically wrong, but it's still bringing in up to here an answer that might look correct. And for most of these, they are correct, but my formula is wrong. So if I started again to bring over some of these here and drag the formula down, I'm getting errors. And that's the reason why this one here is an error, because it's looking up this number here, which is here, but my lookup array has now moved. And if I go to the bottom, obviously it's just looking up some blank cells there. So you do just need to be careful, because had I not had this one here and this wasn't an option, it is pulling in the correct result, but technically it's not correct. That formula is not correct. And if someone wants to add to that later on, obviously they're going to come up with errors. And if you get a new list here, copy and paste it over some of this, then it's not going to be correct. And you always need to amend your formula in the first cell. I would need to amend this here and fully fix it, then drag it down again. The temptation would be, if I came up with errors, just put these here, I could just look and say, oh, that's an error. Oh, let me just, what you can do is drag the formula back up here. So now I get my correct result, and here, oh, let's just amend it here. And you see you get these green flags. It's because you've got different formulas. This formula isn't the same as the one above, because I've now amended that one. So you always need to amend it in the first cell if you notice an error. Let's just quickly do an F4 on those. And then double click here. And that's what you want there. There's the same formula in each cell, but just with the correct referencing. I'm going to go through another example of Xlookup where you might want to pull in two columns, the category and the part description. So I have the formula here of where we pulled in the category, just a simple Xlookup, looking up the value and looking up in the part number column here, and then returning the category column. I'm going to go through it quite quickly this time. I have spent quite a lot of time on the cell referencing, and at the end of the video, once I've gone through all the different examples, I will go through these other criteria here, the if not found and search mode, so you can see where you might want to use those. I just don't want to do too much too soon and just go through the basics first. There are various ways of doing this. Some are more ideal than others. What we could do is use the formula we already have and copy and paste it over into this column here and just make the amendments. I'm going to start this one from scratch, and this time, rather than highlighting the range, I'm actually just going to select the columns just to show you that's another option. Rather than just selecting the actual rows, you can just select the columns, but you just need to make sure you don't have data under your table. Let's start this again. Equals Xlookup, lookup value, comma, lookup array, comma, return array, comma, comma, 0 for exact match, close bracket, enter. And then just drag that down. So we haven't done any cell referencing. We don't actually need to, if we're only working in one column, we don't actually need to, because we selected the whole column as the lookup array and return array. It doesn't matter if these move down a row each time, because it's the whole column, not the actual selected row numbers. It only matters if we were to drag this formula over, then we would need to lock these, because otherwise they're going to move over a column. This will then turn into F and this will be G. So what I'm going to do as a first example is just copy. So just in my formula bar, just highlight that, Control C, press Escape just to come out of it, and then put your cursor in the cell and Control V. So we've got exactly the same formula. If I could just click there, you can see it's exactly the same formula. The first part's all correct, A4, so we're looking at this part number in column E, but we don't want to return column F, that's the category. So it's correct for the category column here. We want to return column G, which is the part description. I can just overtype and just type in the letters G here, but I can also just drag this over and then it automatically changes it there for me, and press enter. And then double click, and I can just do a spot check on one of them. It's just click here, copy, find all, and it should be thumb screws. I would probably do a couple of checks, but that's all correct. So I have got the correct answer. There's nothing really wrong with this, but you have got two different formulas. What can happen is you could easily drag over the formula and overpaste some of these answers. Like here, if I just dragged it over, I've now got that result. And obviously that's wrong. I cannot see it's wrong because it can't be the same, because I've already got this part description for that part number up there. It's not obvious to me that I've made that mistake because it hasn't pulled in an error. It has actually pulled in a part description. So I could easily make that mistake and not realise. If we look in the formula, we can see what's happened. Originally it was A16, so we were looking up this SKU here in column E. Because I dragged this over, it's moved everything over, so now it's looking up column B, which is the category here, and it's looking up in the category column over here. So it's looking up electronic components in the category. What Excel does, it finds the first entry, so it's found it here and then it's returned the answer here. So that's why it's pulled back printed circuit assemblies. So this is why I don't like using different formulas. I tend to have one formula that covers everything, just so I don't make this mistake. Another way is to use this formula that we've already got and drag it over. Now we're going to come up with the same error if I were just to drag that over. It's okay for this one because it is actually the first entry, but if I drag this down, you can see that what it's doing is looking up this in here and bringing back the first answer. So for all the ones that are electronic components, it's always going to bring back that first entry there. What I could do is make sure my cell referencing is correct before I drag it over. So I definitely want to fix this column because my part number is always in column A. I don't want that to move over here to column B. So I've got my $ on my quick access toolbar just in front of the column. We need the row as it is because when we move down a row, we do want this to move with it. So that's correct. And we also want to fix column E because we're looking this part number up in this column here. That's never changing either. So I just press F4 there. And we don't need to fix column F because what will happen is when we drag this formula over, this will move over a column, and that's going to be correct because in here we do want this to move over to column G. So I'm going to leave that as it is, enter. First I'm going to drag it down first and then drag it across, just to make sure that I've got the cell referencing for all of these as well, not just for this column here. So these are the same results we had before when we did it correctly, so I know that they're correct. So that's a better way of doing it. And another way to do it is if I were to delete this, I'm actually going to start this again, and we're going to have one formula that covers everything. So we're going to do equals Xlookup here, here, comma, and then our return array, we want 2 columns. We want the return array to be category and part description. So actually for my return array here, I'm actually just going to highlight both columns and then we'll see what happens. So another comma, and 0 for exact match, close bracket, enter. And let's drag it down, see what happens. Okay, so these are the same results as before, so I'm happy that that's all correct. It is slightly different. You can see there's a blue box around the whole thing whenever I highlight it. I don't need to reference any of these. I've got no dollar signs in here, but it is all correct. Because what's happening is my formula's in this cell here, and you can see it up there. If I click on this cell here, it's greyed out. The Xlookup is looking up this number here, in here, and it's returning this as a whole. It's returning this into this cell, and because it's 2 columns, it's spilling over into 2 columns. So this is being returned as 1 into here, and then just spilling into that cell there. So there's different options there. I don't particularly like that when I'm clicking on here, it's got this blue line. Again, if you don't need this to be refreshed, if you just needed this data, you could just do your copy and paste as values if you don't need this to be dynamic. Xlookup is quite an easy formula, especially when you're just looking for the one column, like the one category in the very first example that we had. For anything more complicated, I tend to use index and match. I'm used to using index and match because Xlookup's only been around a few years. There used to be VLOOKUP and still is VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP for vertical and horizontal lookups, but they had their limitations, so index and match was the better option rather than V and HLOOKUP. But since Xlookup's been introduced, that is the better option for simple lookups. If I have a matrix of data where I have lots of columns and lots of rows, I'd be inclined to use index and match. It looks quite complicated. I'm just going to show you a very simple example of where we're just looking up the category as we did in the very first example of Xlookup, because it pretty much is the same, just in a different order. I've already written the formula. I'm going to go through it here, and then I'm going to go through it from scratch, and then I will take you through index and match individually so you can see how they work together. So I'm probably doing it a bit backwards, but I think it's the best way of doing it. So I've already written the formula here. If you ignore the second line, we'll just look at this first line. So the array is the first criteria. This is actually your return array. So where's the answer? And that's our category column here. We're pulling in the category, so that's what we're indexing. That's what we're pulling in. That's our answer, the category. And then when we go to the next option, it's asking for the row number. That's where we need match because we don't know the row number. We've got several different part numbers here. We can't really manually go through and find which row they're on and type that number into the second part of this formula. Or we could, but it would take a long time and then not be worth doing. So instead, match, if we move on to this part, and we're now in the match formula, we've got the lookup value, like we have with Xlookup. We're looking up the part number, and the lookup array is this SKU column here. And then 0 for exact match. So this part should be familiar from the Xlookup. So it's lookup value, lookup array, exact match, and then your return array is actually the first part. That's the formula. So we're going to do that from scratch here. Equals index, open bracket, And again, ignore that second line, we're just going by the first one. Index, where's our answer? The category. So select that cell there, Control Shift arrow down, F4 to fully reference that range, comma. Now it's asking for the row number. We don't know. We need match to find it for us. So match this, comma, and then select this range here. Control Shift arrow down, F4, comma, 0 for an exact match, close bracket. We just need one more bracket because that bracket's just closing off your match. You need one to close off the whole formula there, and it's in red, so you can see that it hasn't finished the formula. So just put one more bracket in there, and you can see that's in black there. So that's our formula. Press enter, and then I just double click or just drag it down, and again I can just see that they're the correct results there. So I'm going to go through index and match individually so you can really get the hang of how they work, but I really urge you to get the hang of this one because I use this all the time, and it does also get your head around the cell referencing. So here I'm going to break down index and match. Index I don't really use apart from when I'm doing index and match, whereas match I do sometimes use for other things or on its own, and I'll show you that later. Index is basically just bringing you an answer, and it's asking you for an address. So if we look at the syntax here, array, row number, column number, it's asking you for the answer. So we've selected a range, but it's asking you how many rows do you want to go down and how many columns do you want to go across. At the moment we're just dealing with one column, so we can ignore the second bit and just look at the row. So essentially it's just asking you for an address in this column. So if we knew the row number, we could just manually type that in, but obviously in real life that isn't helpful at all. But let's just go through that. So I've already done it here, but let's just do it again from scratch. So I could say equals index, open bracket, click here, Control Shift arrow down, so you've got the whole range, F4 to absolute reference that range, and then comma, row number. I know this is on row number 8. And when I say row number 8, I mean in this range, I want to go down 8 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's here. So I can manually type in 8, close brackets, and that's my answer. I can't really drag this down because it's giving me the same answer. I have to then work out which row that's on. I already counted earlier. It's on row 355 of this range. So I can then just enter there 355 and it brings me the correct answer. So you can see the formula there. You've got the range, all these part descriptions here, and then you tell it which row number it's on. Obviously that isn't going to work or be of any use to you. Whereas here you can see match actually gives us those answers, 8 and 355. So although the formula looked complicated, I've just replaced that number, that row number, with this formula here, and then it works out the row number for you, and it's dynamic. I don't need to do a different one for each row. That will work for everything. So let's just do match on its own here. Equals match, lookup value, the part number in the part number column here, Control Shift arrow down, F4 to absolute reference, comma, 0 for an exact match, close the bracket. So it's found that on row 8, so it returns the number 8. And I drag that down and it's found this on row 355, so it's returned 355. So there are numbers that we used in this formula here, so we can overtype those with this formula, which is what I've done here. So we've got the index here where you've got the answer, the return array, the part description range, and then here is your match, which tells you the row number that it's on. You could also do the same for the category and part description. So if I copy that and just paste it here, I'm going to paste it, I'm going to transpose it. I don't want them next to each other, I want one beneath the other. So I can actually use this here, and now we've got them here. So I could say equals match this value, lookup array here, F4, 0 for an exact match. It's in column 1. And the part description is in column 2. So remember, in our original index formula, if we look at the syntax, it's asking for row and column. So this is where we can use it if we've got a matrix of data, if we need a row and a column number. So when we've got the answer, you're looking how many rows do we go down, how many columns are we going across. So the match works for the row and the column, and that's what we're going to go through next, bringing it all together. So that is obviously a very long formula because you're going to have index, match, then another match. But hopefully now I've broken that down, that's going to make more sense. And when you look at a very long formula, you'll be able to break it down yourself. Here we're going to look at index and match, looking at rows and columns. So I've got 2 columns to fulfill here. So I'm just going to go ahead and start it because I think I've been through it in quite a lot of detail. Equals index, open bracket. So my return array, or my array where my answer is, well, for this cell it's going to be the category, but I am going to drag this formula over. So I also want it to take into account the part description. So my array is going to be this range here. So if I just do Control Shift arrow down, I've got J to K, that's 4 to 1389. Just going to press F4 to absolute reference that range, comma, row number, don't know, so we need match to find this part number in this range here. So that's match, open bracket, this is my lookup value, and I'm going to do my referencing here. So for this, I need to put a $sign in front of the column because I don't want that lookup of the part number to move over, but I do want it to move down every time I move down a row. So for the lookup value for the row, I want a $sign in front of the column, comma, and lookup array is here, the part numbers, Control Shift arrow down, F4, comma, 0 for an exact match, close the bracket on the match, comma, because now we're looking at columns, I need to know, am I looking in the category or the part description column? So again, I do match, lookup value this. So for the column, I need to put a $sign in front of the row, because when I drag this down, I don't want the row to move down. My header is always in row 3, so that's why I need a $sign in front of the 3, comma, and my lookup array is here, F4, absolute reference, comma, 0 for an exact match, close the bracket. I need to close one more bracket because I'm only closing off the match. I need to close off the whole formula there. Another bracket, enter. Let's drag it down first. That all looks good. And that all looks good just because I can remember those were the answers from our Xlookup examples. What's good about index and match is it doesn't have to be in a particular order. If I were to change these around, so if I copy and paste that there and the category there, it still works because it's looking up these headers rather than looking up the order of the columns. And I've got a matrix here where I've just added in, so we've got the same data here, but I've just made up a country of origin and a price. And I put this in a different order. So I've got part description category, which is different to there, and then the price. So again, I'm just going to do it again from scratch, equals index. And I've got the country of origin here in the middle. I need the price and I need the category and the part description. It doesn't matter if I select this, because if it can't find it, then it's just going to bring back the answer. So my whole index range can be this, and Control Shift arrow down, F4, comma, and then my match is going to be the part number, and I need to just put a $sign in front of the column, and this is my lookup array, Control Shift arrow down, F4, comma, 0 for an exact match, close the bracket, comma, and now for the column we need another match to match the headers, match this, and I need to put a dollar sign in front of the row because my headers are always on row 3. Comma, lookup array, all of my headers. And again, my country of origin isn't over here, but it doesn't matter. If it can't find it, it's just going to ignore it. F4, comma, 0 for an exact match, close bracket on the match, and close bracket to the whole formula. And again, drag it down. So I've got my part description first this time. Got my categories, they all look good. Again, I would always do a spot check. And then I just made up a random price. So let's just look at some of these. £7 for that top one. Let's just look at something a bit further down, one we haven't looked at before. Obviously, I've made these prices up. A laptop isn't going to be £3. Let's just look at that one. So it should be a digital video recorder, £5. Bargain. Digital video recorder, £5, and it's in the UK. So if I could, then if I copy the country of origin, copy, and I can bring that over, and I can drag my formula, and that country of origin was the UK. We can look at this one, EC008 is Spain, that's correct. And again, if you change them around, rather than adding a column, I could have just replaced and just had it there and then put the price at the end. So you can move it around. That's what's so good about index and match. It doesn't matter what order. It's looking for this number here and it's looking for the header. Doesn't matter what row or column it's on. It's always finding those headers wherever they are. So you can change your data and the order as much as you like. So as I already mentioned, I really urge you to get your head around this. I think in general this is a very useful formula, index and match, and just to get used to navigating your way around Excel, the cell referencing. I think index and match is ideal for that. I just wanted to show you if. I actually have a whole nother tutorial on if, because if is a very powerful function and you're going to use it a lot. I use it all the time. We wouldn't usually use it as a lookup, but I don't know if you noticed or see any possible problems that you might have with Xlookup and index and match. I've got here some part numbers, and let's say these are the vendors who we could purchase these part numbers from. So we've actually got multiple. Usually when you're working with data, you might have transactional data like sales data or purchasing data, and then you have your master data. Usually with your master data, it should be unique values. So I don't know if you've heard of like one-to-many. So if you're doing a lookup, your master data is going to be 1. It's going to be a unique value. But in your transactional data, that data might be mentioned several times. So that's going to be your many. Therefore, with Xlookup and index and match, they actually can only pull in one result. So if you have more than one option, like here, this is a part number, but we can buy it from 2 different vendors. If I were to do an Xlookup on that part number, it's not wrong. It does give me an answer, but it only looks through that list, and as soon as it finds an answer, it brings it back. It thinks it's already got the answer, so it doesn't continue looking. I'm only ever going to get one answer when I'm using Xlookup or index and match. Really, that's not ideal. So you do need to be familiar with your data before you're choosing which formula to use. If you know you've got unique data and you're looking at master data and its unique values, you could then pull in, like before we pulled in a category. If that part number only has one category, then you don't need to worry about this. Xlookup or index and match is going to be fine. But if you've got something where you've got multiple entries for the same thing, you are going to need to find a way around that. So that's where I use the if formula instead of index and match. It's not very often I have to do this. Over here, again, it's a nested formula. We've got text join and if. And I'm also going to add another one in the mix after this, just to show you what you might need to look out for as well. When you're looking at these formulas, it can be quite complicated. So I tend to look in the middle part or the end part of the formula first, especially if is a main part of the formula that just happens to be wrapped in another formula to make it cleaner. So if we look at if here, what we're saying is if and we're choosing the range first. A5, it's just got the dollar signs that makes it a little bit more confusing. A5 to A27, that's A5 to A27. So what we're saying is if any of these part numbers here match this part number, then you want to return B5 to B27, which is the vendor name. The syntax for if is the logical test. So the logical test is if any of these part numbers match this cell here. That's the logical test. Then the next part is what do you want to do if that value is true? If it's true, I want to return the vendor name. If it's not true, so if it's false, I don't want to return anything at all. And again, you may want to come back to this after you've watched the if tutorial. So this has returned Electronics 101 and ABC Electronics because it found this part number, it looked for this part number, it found it twice here and here, and it's returned both of those to this cell. With EC002, so it's looking for this in this blue bit here. So if any of these, so this range here of part numbers equals this one, we've moved down a row now, then return any, and then return all of these, and it's returned 3 of them, which is correct. 1, 2, 3. And if we look at another one here, 5, it's these two, and EC010 is just that one there. I'm just going to go through it just doing the if part first, and you'll see then why I have to wrap it in text join. Equals if these part numbers F4 to absolutely reference that range equals this, don't need to reference that at all, so that's my logical test, comma, value if true, my vendor name, F4, value if false, just blank, that's your 2 quotation marks for blank text or nothing, and close bracket. So it's given me the right answers, but it spills down the whole length of this, as you can see. I need these in one cell because I then can't drag that formula down because I can't see this result because this is in the way. So that's why I need text join. Text join or concatenate brings everything into one cell. So I've got my if formula, but it's spilling onto the rows. So I can wrap it in text join, open bracket, delimiter, I'm just going to separate them by a comma and a space, just because a comma might not be that clear. So in quotation marks, comma, space, close quotation. And then after the delimiter, ignore empty, true. So I could just double click there, I'll write the word true, comma, and then my text 1 is my if formula. I'm applying that text join to whatever the answer is in my if statement, and that's those two, Electronics 101, ABC Electronics, that's my text, the if statement. And then I just need to close off a bracket here, and there you go, it's all in one. And then if I drag that down, I get the same answers as over here. It does it for each one. I might need to also wrap it in unique. If, for example, I had a duplicate and this was also mentioned down here, if I just replace one of these here. So this is mentioned twice. So now over here, I've got Electronics 101 there, and I've got it again at the end. I only need to see it once. I don't need to see it as many times as it's listed. I just need to see it once. So I could also then just here wrap it in unique, open bracket. That's all I need. Unique is just the array, and that's my if statement. And I just need another bracket at the end there. So now you can see I haven't got it repeated again at the end. Don't worry if you don't understand this formula here. It is actually quite advanced. I've mainly brought it up because I just don't want you to rely on Xlookup, index and match, or any other formula really, without thinking about your data first. You really need to be familiar with your data. It's hard when you're learning Excel because you could be so pleased with yourself that you've got the Xlookup or the index and match to work without really considering, oh, were there duplicates in that file, or were there any other scenarios that I need to cater for. Sometimes there are exceptions to the rule. You do need to be creative sometimes. So obviously it's important to learn the formulas, get the structure right, get the cell referencing right. But once you've learned all of this, you do need to actually consider your data and how it's structured. Yeah, are there any discrepancies to work out the best formula for your data? As you go along, you'll be learning things like pivot tables and Power Query as well, and some of those things will replace the formulas. It is good to know, though, I don't always like using pivot tables. They're not very flexible sometimes, and certainly if I'm doing a chart, I would rather my chart feed off some of my data that I've calculated using formulas rather than a pivot table. And even when you're using Power Query, which is quite advanced, you're still going to come across the same errors, that if your raw data not necessarily is incorrect, but has discrepancies or exceptions that are going to skew your data, you do need to be familiar with it. It is possible when you're using formulas to obviously manipulate the data to overcome some of those discrepancies, but ideally if you come across an error or something that doesn't quite look right, you really need to correct that at source and amend the system or master data or the database, rather than having the output for the data in Excel then having to correct it. Anyway, keep going, watch other tutorials. The more you learn, the more it does actually fit into place. Sometimes you might need to go backwards and forwards and go back to look at the basics, the formatting, some of the shortcuts. You know, once you've learned some of these formulas, you might have forgotten some of those basics. And obviously the formulas and the pivot tables, the charts, the Power Query is the more interesting stuff. So it's tempting to skip to those, which is fine. You can do that and then go back later and look at the basics or refresh yourself on the basics. Sometimes it is better to see the bigger picture and what is possible further down the line, and to make some of those basics even make sense. Thanks for watching.